I'd like to introduce our next guest, Ray McMorrow. Is that you pronounce it? Yep, good. He's from the National Working Group, who's going to be talking about the sexual abuse from some of the work that they do nationally and some of the work, the people that they support around the country. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our next guest speaker, Ray. And
good evening. My privilege to speak to you all this evening in Newcastle. Sort of working this off, being on myself, will cover this from two different angles, really. And what I'm very aware of is we have very different levels of experience and background amongst the attendees this evening. So for some of you, I might be saying something you already know a great deal about, but we want to touch on the young people themselves and something of the relationship between what we often use the word perpetrator behaviour and victim behaviour or the abused. From the reports, we get very involved as an organisation with a wide range of networks. We also have the privilege of really working through all the many different reports. My background is in health, so I come from being a safeguarding health and a mental health nurse. So I've been working with young people for many, many years, too many for me to want to quote today. But on some of the studies, we've had some very clear messages from young people themselves, and it may reflect something of the difference around the better we understand the sexual exploitation of young people, the more likely we are to see something, and potentially people seeing something as an epidemic at the moment, or it's happening everywhere, when in fact, you know, it may actually be that we're beginning to identify things. There was a young man speaking, young boxer speaking to her last week from the north, who actually described it as, you know, that once he could see what was happening around young people, he felt like he became aware that there was a sewer under his feet. All of a sudden he could see things he hadn't seen before. Messages we have, really, the first one seems like the obvious, but one thing young people say is, if you don't ask me, I won't tell you what's happening to me. So the young people themselves won't tell you. So if you don't ask the young people, they won't tell you what's happening. So if we start to ask them, they may start to tell us their stories and what it's about. But very often we don't ask young people about these things. An awful lot is talked about grooming, and that the grooming process has been described in the media a great deal, but it's not always that sexual exploitation involves grooming. In fact, it may not. It can be. It can happen in the flick of a switch around blackmail, around issues like that, where anywhere where power and control can be taken very quickly from the young person by somebody older and in power, then that can lead. Violence can be part of that as well. All of the cases covered by the media, at the start of this evening we talked a great deal about the media, and the media has taken a specific focus, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But one thing we've seen is boys and young men are also vulnerable to sexual exploitation, and in some ways their story, it's very difficult to get their story out into the public eye at the moment. It may be that, like child abuse or child sexual abuse some years back, we often hear the girl's story before we hear boys' stories, and there are reasons why that is the case. What we experience often is that boys who've been victims are often picked up as perpetrators of criminal activity. There are a couple of reasons for that. That often what we focus on is behaviour around young people, and that's I think that's recognised beyond the area of CSE. And the other issue is around boys is that part of getting them under the control, if you're talking about a gang or a situation like that, part of the control can be to get them involved in criminal activity in the first place. Once you become involved in criminal activity, you're vulnerable to being blackmailed, to people telling your family what you're involved in, or people reporting you to the police. So you become a victim. This is a picture I took from the metro one day while I was sitting on the train, and I looked it up and took it down. And I think this tells us something of a story. It also tells us something about the general capacity of the human condition. Imam talked about the human condition, and often we're very good at looking in the same direction. It's a part of human nature. Is we all, if somebody looks at something, you know, if I look at a building on the street, several other people will look at the building and say, "What's he looking at?" And in the case of human behaviour, we often follow the same lens. This is a piece of work that's become involved in surgery and different areas now, where they recognise that if a team starts to look at a problem in one part of somebody's body when they're operating, they will fail to recognise symptoms that are actually telling them that something else really bad is happening. So in the case of CSE, one of the things that's happened with the media is they are largely focusing on pardon the sort of the mixture. They will either use Asian, they'll use Pakistani, Muslim, they use various names about this to describe what they're looking for. But that's because that's where the narrative has come from. And coming from Derby myself, I was part of the team with the original Operation Retriever case, and so that picture of model is what the media have become most focused on. So sometimes that makes it much more difficult to see other stories. The media always follow stories in that way. I want to talk about abused consent, and it's I owe this to Jenny Pierce, who's a professor at the University of Bedford. But the story of abused consent is really important in understanding what's just been described by the Imam around childhood and some of the issues around child sexual exploitation. Some in the public will often say, these girls had it coming for them. They were 14, they were on the streets, they were dressed provocatively. These gave me reasons to believe that they were able to make decisions for themselves, so they got what they deserved. And I've heard that in my own community, in the streets, that they got what they deserved sometimes. And sometimes that's because you don't know what it is that happened. Think differently if they did. But just up here, there is 4 spheres here, and part of that consent depends on a number of things. The one we always, if I go to the top sphere, we spend a lot of time in the media talking about this. This is abused consent because actually somebody's grooming them, they're under pressure, etc. The whole pressure comes from that being abused. You're in a vulnerable situation, I've groomed you, so you think you've got consent because we permitted it. But there are other elements to that. Sometimes there are financial issues. People who are in poverty can be more vulnerable to victimhood than others. The poverty of their own, the need for, it can be a poverty around financial need, hunger. It can be a poverty around emotional need. So those needs make young people vulnerable in those situations where they have needs and they believe it can be satisfied somewhere else. Sometimes a financial need for a family. So what sometimes young people believe if they can bring in money to the family, they become vulnerable in those ways. Then there's the normalised, where we start to normalise it for within the peer group themselves. Lots of anxiety around what young people are seeing online, on looking at what's on the online pornography, etc., which introduce the idea that some of the behaviour, some of what they're seeing, some extreme acts of sexuality that they're seeing on the media may actually impact what they think is normal, what's normal for us. And young people who are being sexually exploited will want to normalise because we want to normalise our experiences. We want to be normal. None of us want to be freaks. We actually want to be normal. So they will normalise it in that way. But the top one, which applies, I call it professional negligence, but it's also community negligence. It's also when we decide that those young people are different than the other young people. Those young people live different lives. Therefore, what's happening to them is different than what's happening to my family, to my children. It's not the same, for my children, because they're different. And all sorts of professionals, doctors, teachers, everybody can be guilty of thinking, that somebody, and I don't know the Northeast very well, but when I travel around the country, I always find that there's some part of each town or each city where people say, it's different down there, they live different lives. They don't have the same moral positions as others. And actually, it's simply not true. It's a way of distancing yourself from the experiences of those people. Communities can play those parts as well. Those young people are different than the other young people. And it can also play a part around what happens to communities themselves. We can actually start to think that certain criminal elements of our own communities are different, and we don't want to think about them, we don't want to know about them. And in not wanting to know about them, we're allowing behaviours amongst adults that we might see as completely unacceptable within our own family. And it's really important that we address those things as communities as well as professionals. Great deal of focus on groups. Groups, they come together, sometimes groups come together in person, sometimes they come together online. And for some of them it involves financial gain, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it is around the sexual act and the power and control of those things. Sometimes it's organised and sometimes it's opportunist. But I want to talk about what we learn about young people. And these are young people from all elements, all different communities that have come to our attention. And there are certain things, I always put at the front the bereavement one, because it's something that sort of, I think, surprised us originally, was that the number of young people who suffered some form of bereavement prepubescent or around a time when they're going through difficult stages in their life and somebody in their family dies. We as professionals often have missed this. We don't pick it up as important. Either we don't pick it up as important because we don't recognise that grandmum dying might be really important, that perhaps grandmum is mum's biggest supporter and actually mum will struggle without her. We also don't pick up that mum herself might then be bereaved and upset and therefore not in the best position to parent the young person at that time. Sometimes it's a father who's died, and if a father's died, people still think, oh, mother's still there, etc. But actually, there's all sorts of impacts upon them. Domestic violence, very common in families. Young people, where they're in houses where domestic violence has taken place, often want to be out. And when they're out and about, they are more vulnerable. Once you're outside of parental supervision, then the risks of being exploited become greater. What's really important about this is, because this is a community event, the importance in here is about the community as well. Because if you have a sense, and I know people often talk in the Northeast in the past, there was one time when it was a community who brought up children. So actually, if the community were alert towards young people, and in that way, then that would be another support for young people, and would make sure. Sometimes we want to remove young people from, they're hanging around the shopping centre or that, and people say, oh no, we should move them on. They look like they're causing trouble. But where are you moving them to? You move them to the park, and they're down in the park, and now they're even more vulnerable because they're down in the park, and there's even less. So sometimes when we're moving young people on, we're putting them at greater danger because of perceived, sometimes adult, that they're causing trouble or things like that. But actually often we're moving them into dangerous places. Various family adversity. A lot is found in our statistics around alcohol and substance misuse problems, mental health problems, that both the young people suffer, but also that their families suffer, and the risks to them about that, and again leading to them being more vulnerable because those things are happening. In some cases, the young people have had earlier child abuse and sometimes sexualization at a younger age, which makes them much more vulnerable to understand what relationships are about. There is a relationship between early attachment and sexual exploitation. I just want to touch on one piece of research, because I don't want to be too technical tonight, and I know Albert says don't be too technical, but there's one piece that is, I think, understood by the public, is that in the past 20 years, puberty has almost dropped by 2 years. It's a huge, in the history of our time, that's a huge issue. Puberty drops by 2 years. So suddenly, when we're expecting puberty to happen at around the age of 13 or 14, it's happening at 11, 12, even 10 in some cases. They're going through puberty. At the same time, studies of brain functioning shows that actually the same isn't happening in the brain. The brain isn't developing quicker. So what's happening to young girls and boys is, in fact, they're faced with going through puberty and all the hormonal challenges, whilst their brain is still much younger. So they're faced with their own experience of sexualization with much less tools to manage it. So that's something different than thinking about just, what's happening online, activities, etc., and those things. There are other things that mean they're becoming more vulnerable, and that they're to be perceived as sexualized objects by adults. So the challenge of keeping them safe is a big challenge. 2 minutes? Okay. I'll do the next 20-something. I won't go through this, but actually, so some of the things we have to do is they depend greatly on us adults. And I call this the theatre of fragmented youth. If you've had a really bad time, if you've had bereavement, all of those things, then you've got even less tools with which to manage these issues. And in some ways, the danger is you become a sitting duck to criminality. That actually, that when you're engaging, the person who's better at engaging you sometimes is somebody who wants to abuse you. Sometimes we as a community, we as teachers, we as nurses, we as social workers, don't have enough time, and that's why the third sector and the community are really important, because they have the chance to bridge that experience, to be closer to them. That same boxer, I was really struck by his stories about how he got engaged with young people, so he'd tell them stories, because they're doing things together. And that's critical to actually helping young people. It's actually having time with them. It's hearing their story. They aren't going to tell you what's happening to them straight away. Some of the issues they want from health. These are the issues, but I'm sure they're the issues from everyone else. What do I want from you as professionals? Look interested. Tell us who you are. Introduce yourself. Keep eye contact with me. Look up from your computer. It's an interesting question, isn't it? And have a passion for your job is the one that I love. And it's something that struck me all through the years is young people, they don't want you to get down with them and be one of them, thank you. No, What they want is to know that you care about what you're doing. And if you care about what you're doing, then they actually know that you will take what they bring to you as being serious. That's really important. Because that's what people who want to criminally damage young people will do, is all of these things. So if you can't do it, somebody else will. And there's a list there, I think, that we have here of the sort of different elements of what they bring to us. But I just want to go to, mostly when young people come to adults, they don't talk about being sexually exploited. They talk about these issues. They talk about stomach upsets, feeling poorly, some problems with drug and alcohol. For some people, they come because they've got sexually transmitted, and they're concerned about sexually transmitted diseases. If they're concerned about sexually transmitted diseases, it's probably because they're not in control of their sexual activity and they're worried. So if they're coming for multiple testing, there are very good reasons for them doing it. And injuries that are poorly explained. Because I find that most young people are very proud of their injuries. They will tell you about them. If they're not telling you about them, it's because there's something wrong in how they achieve those. And we shouldn't believe about them being over-resilient for the very reason I just touched on around, remember, they're dealing with more, with no more tools in which to deal with it. I'm not going to cover them ones today, but the outcome for young people is very poor. Now, this last one, I just want to touch, these statistics I put up because they're actually American ones. They actually come from California. They come from a different community completely to ours. There are very few of the same structures to this community. They have similar levels of CSE as far as we can see, yet it's an African American population, it's Caucasian connections, there's no historical Pakistani, Muslim, whatever population there, yet the statistics around CSE are the same. So I think it reflects what the Imam says about it. This is about people doing things to other people in ways that they control them. Okay, thank you.
thank you very much for that. Extremely enlightening perspective from the victim's perspective. I'd like to also invite Bina Palmer from the same organisation, from the National Working Group.
Hi for me. Hi, good evening everyone. Just before I start, can I just, it'll only take a couple of seconds of your time, but can I just do a quick activity? Can I ask you all just to stand up, please? I think everyone stood up. Ray's not stood up. That's it, thank you. Can everyone sit down again, please? Thank you. Okay, you might think I've gone a bit mad. That's fine. But there's a reason why I asked you to do that. And the reason is because you didn't have to. Can I ask you why you stood up? Because I'm an authoritative figure. Okay, you didn't have to stand up, did you? You could have said, no, I don't want to. You could have collectively had a discussion and thought, no, why should we have to stand up? But you didn't, did you? Because we all live in a very polite society. And I'm stood here and I'm addressing you guys. So you stood up because I asked you to, but nobody told you to. I asked you to, and I asked you quite politely, I think. But Ray decided not to. If you think about vulnerable young people, and if you think that they're vulnerable because of some of the reasons that Ray described, they've had problems at home, they might have been bullied, they might have come from a family breakdown situation, they might have been suffering from bereavement, so they're very vulnerable and they've been targeted. They've been targeted by abusers. Abusers from any different community. And they're being forced and they're being controlled and they're being manipulated and they're being coerced. And they're telling these young girls and boys, because it is boys as well, and the abusers, men and women, they're telling these young people to commit sex acts and to do all sorts of horrific things. Are these young people going to do these things? And are they consenting to do those things? Because they do those things, that doesn't mean to say they're consenting. And it goes back to the abuse consent that Ray spoke about. Think about the consequences of those young people saying no. And there will be consequences, because we know that these abusers make threats of violence to those young people, to their friends, to their families. And in a lot of cases, they carry out these threats. And I'm not saying this to sensationalise the issue. I'm saying this because it's reality. Some of the cases that we've been involved in, and you may have already heard that young people in some cases have been branded with cigarettes. They've been horrifically abused violently and sexually. And in a case that we heard about recently, a girl was murdered by the perpetrator of her friend who was being sexually exploited, because this girl tried to stand up for her friend. She tried to talk to organisations, to services, she tried to talk to the police, she tried to talk to social workers, and nobody listened. Nobody took those threats seriously. And again, I'm not sensationalising this issue, this is what reality is. So that's the reason why I did that activity, just to make you realise, or help you realise, that actually these young people don't have a choice. They don't choose to commit these acts. They're forced and they're controlled and they're manipulated, because the consequences of saying no are so great that for them they have no other choice. Okay, so what do we know about child sexual exploitation? A recent piece of research conducted by the Office of the Children's Commissioner, which was a 2-year piece of research, found that 16,500 young people are identified as at being at risk of sexual exploitation. And so 16,500 were identified as at risk, and 2,409 were identified as actual victims of child sexual exploitation by a group or a gang. And we need to remember that that was only one model of child sexual exploitation. Ray showed you that picture of all the people at the zoo looking in one direction, and actually there was something quite significant behind them. If we focus on one model of child sexual exploitation, for example the group or gang associated model, and we forget about those abusers that are targeting people online, that are sexually exploiting people online, if we think about professionals that are sexually exploiting young people, if we forget about those other groups and we focus on this one particular model of perpetrators, then there is a huge risk of us potentially missing a very large group of vulnerable young people who are being sexually exploited. So we need to think about the wider possibility of actually, there is a lot of people capable of committing these offences, and they don't just come from one community. And there's a wide range of young people who are vulnerable. There are people who are vulnerable from the looked after setting, so young people in residential children's homes. But if you think about those professionals that are looking after those young people in those children's homes, they've potentially been through safeguarding training, they've potentially attended events like this, so might have some sort of knowledge around some of the issues that these young people face. But what about those parents and carers who don't work in the safeguarding arena, who haven't had any training or awareness? How do they know how to protect their young people? So those young people are also very, very vulnerable, and it doesn't just happen to one particular group of young people. So, barriers to identification. There are clearly a lot of barriers to young people coming forward. Some of those I've already spoken about, so some of the consequences of saying no, so fear of violence, but also fear of not being believed, a fear of being seen as a liar, a fear of being seen as asking for it, consenting, a fear of authorities. If they've had bad experiences of authorities already, then there might be a fear of seeking support because they've already felt let down. So those barriers are present for the majority, if not all, of the victims of child sexual exploitation. But if you think about particular vulnerable groups, so if you think about young people from the BME community, for example, they will be faced with several other barriers. So threats of forced marriage, for example, if they speak to services, threats of honour-based violence, threats of potentially and risks of forced genital mutilation. Blackmail connected to shame and dishonour might also be a barrier to disclosure and seeking support. Dependency on drugs and alcohol, and that could be a barrier for all young people. And I talked about fear of violence and not being believed, but in some particular cases there's the fear of not being believed by their own families as well. So we need to think about that very vulnerable group of young people. There's also barriers for boys and young men. Again, will be very similar to some of the barriers we've already talked about, but there are additional barriers. So social attitudes towards young men being seen as quite physically strong, physically able to look after themselves, but actually the control and the psychological impact that these perpetrators have on their victims doesn't make them any more able to protect themselves than girls and young women. So expectations about the masculine behaviour, being seen as indicating weakness, but it's not weakness, is it? It's the fact that they're being controlled and manipulated. They're just as vulnerable as girls and young women. And attitudes of the society. So it's all of our responsibility to make sure that we protect our children and young people. And there was a question asked earlier about how many of us have children. Now, I don't have children. So you might be thinking, well, what does she know? Well, I was a child myself. And during this work, I've been working in this field for quite a number of years now, and I've seen far too many young people being let down. Far too many services not listening, not identifying, not seeing what's in front of them. Far too many young people being abused, violated, and subject to sexual violence, physical violence, and emotional violence. So for me, I have that passion that Ray was talking about, because I want to care, I want to protect, and I want to look after them. And I think we all have a responsibility to want to look after our children and young people within our community. So we talk about the partnership approach, and many of you here, working in the professional field, working in the safeguarding arena, you have a responsibility, but actually it's wider than that. Ray mentioned the boxing club. People like sports clubs, police officers, social workers, but what about the wider community, like hotels, taxi drivers, leisure centres, restaurants? All of these people, young people, are taken to a number of different locations, and it happens in every area. So we all have an opportunity to identify potentially risky situations, and we all have a responsibility to share that information. We all have gut instincts, and we should respond to those gut instincts, because 9 times out of 10 they're probably right. If you think something's not right, then the likelihood is something isn't right. So we all have a responsibility to share that information, talk to our colleagues, talk to our community, and try and identify the victims of these crimes and also the perpetrators of these crimes at the earliest opportunity to try and minimise any risks from escalating. So this is just a very limited list of some of the people that we need to be including in our partnership approach to tackling this issue. And one way of responding to this issue, from our point of view, was to develop a national awareness raising campaign. So we developed an awareness raising campaign called Say Something If You See Something. And one of the reasons we did this is because we know it's happening. We know it's happening every day in a number of different locations and in a number of different premises. But also national guidance, which was published by the government in 2009, stated that sexual exploitation is not limited to particular geographical areas, and all safeguarding children's boards should assume that it is an issue in their area. And I think it's pretty safe to say that we know more and more that it's happening in every area that we are aware of. And we work at a national level, we have a national remit, and we've travelled up and down the country in the last three years, and there isn't one single area that we've been to and thought, actually, no, it's not happening here. It's actually happening everywhere. The Home Office recently launched their Modern Slavery campaign, and those figures state that in 2013, 1% of forced labour victims referred to services came from the restaurant or bar sector, and 41% of those victims were trafficked for sexual exploitation. 44 people were sexually exploited in hotels. So we know that it's happening, we have evidence of this. While the numbers coming to light are small, the hidden nature of this crime means actual numbers are likely to be higher. And we talked about some of the reasons for the hidden nature of this crime. It's because young people from vulnerable groups within the society are struggling to come forward to talk about what's happening to them, but also due to lack of awareness and a lack of training within the community and amongst professionals about how to identify this issue, how to respond to this issue, and how to protect them once they've been identified. Another reason why it's such a hidden nature is because perpetrators are very clever, or from all different groups within the community, are very clever and very manipulative in what they do. And when I talked about not focusing on one model, there is a number of different models. And we think about Jimmy Saville, for example. And the reason why that case in particular was so high profile is because he was famous, not because he was white. But yet, in a lot of other cases, the ethnicity is the main focus. And why is that? Actually, these men are committing crimes against children, regardless of their ethnicity. This is just a CCTV image captured in a hotel in the Midlands of a man taking two young girls into the Jury's Inn hotel. It later transpired that the girl in the front who's clutching a teddy bear, she was actually raped at the hotel by this man that's taken her into the hotel. Now, had that hotel have had some sort of training or awareness around these issues, known how to respond, known how to identify particular signs of risk, then would that crime have been committed? We don't know that it would have been prevented, but there would have been a better chance that the hotel would have been able to identify that something was wrong. So clearly there is a need to identify this issue within hotels, within leisure transport, retail, all sorts of different industries and the wider community. So I touched upon Say Something If You See Something. It's a campaign that we've developed at a national level to tackle this issue. And initially responding to issues such as the one that I've just shown you, where that man took that young girl into the hotel and sexually assaulted her, but also responding to a number of other national issues that we've become aware of in different locations. And this toolkit consists of posters, leaflets, refusal logs, risk assessments, information sharing tools, all sorts of different resources. It's completely free and it's available on our website, because what we want to do is we want to get the message out there. We want to encourage people to identify and respond to the issue. We want to create a zero tolerance attitude within society to these horrendous crimes. So that is available. We launched it at Westminster in November last year, and we've had a lot of support. We know that it's been adopted and implemented at a local level in a number of different areas, and we want people to continue to use this to raise that message and to raise further a further zero tolerance attitude towards this. And this is just a quick list of myth busting, because we do want to, the idea of this seminar is to to bust some of these myths and misconceptions and stereotypes around who the victims are, who the perpetrators are, and what CSE actually looks like. So thank you very much.